historian.
Sorry, I'm going to start recording. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Sorry, Rosalind.
No problem. Dr. Alicia Barber is a professional historian, educator, and authority on the history and cultural landscapes of Reno, Nevada, and the American West. From 2003 to 2013, she taught in the history department of UNR, where she also directed the University of Nevada Oral History Program. Through her firm Stories in Place, she works on exhibits and historical markers, oral histories, and multimedia projects, including Reno Historical, Illuminating Reno's Divorce Industry, and the 4th Street Prater Way History Project. Her historical installations can be found at sites throughout the region, including the Nevada State Capitol, Nevada State Library and Archives, Reno City Plaza, the historic downtown Reno Post Office, RTC 4th Street Station, and RTC Centennial Plaza. The author of Reno's Big Gamble, Image and Reputation in the Biggest Little City, she produced and hosted the history feature Time and Place for KUNR Public Radio, and writes a free e-newsletter about Reno's urban development called the Barber Brief, which I must sign up for. So over to you, Alicia. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, and thanks for the invitation. I have a special place in my heart for the UU congregation and the church itself, where I got married. So I'm happy to talk to you. And I knew that I was told that you had read the book Color of Law, and was asked by Rosalind if I could talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing lately on African American history in Reno. And because I had recently done a talk for the Historic Reno Preservation Society about some of that recent research, I already had this PowerPoint together, and I thought, well, why don't we just use that as just something to look at, so you're not just looking at my face. But I can kind of overview some of the things that we've been working on, and you can just ask questions, I'll just kind of have it up, but I think feel free to just ask a question in the middle or clarification or something. It really was a way for me to try to help bring together, co-presenting it with Ken and Demetris Dalton of Our Story Inc., who I collaborate with a lot now, increasingly.
Oh.
And so they came and we all did the talk together, and
Whoa.
It was really terrific because we could do this talk again. It was one that we did at the Washoe County Library, and it just happened to coincide with Super Bowl Sunday, but we had a surprisingly good turnout. It started a couple hours before the game, but so we had some really good conversations afterwards with a lot of members of the community who we've been working with more, including the congregation of the Bethel AME Church, which has been a little bit under threat by some downtown development plans. So we got to touch base with that congregation and its pastor and its board, and that's been kind of ongoing. So why don't I just share my screen and I can just narrate kind of as I go here, if I'm able to do that. Okay. Pick the right screen here. See how that's working. Okay. Go back to this one. Okay, so are everybody seeing this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we are seeing it, but what we're seeing is the speaker view, so we can see your slides on the left and the next slide on the right and any speaker notes. Did you intend to share all of that?
No. Let me see if I can go over and share this as it's on another screen. Here we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. There we go. It only took me twice. Okay. So what I wanted to clarify was that I've been working in this area for, off and on for a while, but really more intensively in the last 5 years. And there has been a lot of research into, Reno's African American history before me. In fact, Elmer Rusko, who was at UU, did a great deal. And so he kind of paved the way in many ways for a lot of the research that we're doing now. in his extensive career, and a lot of his archives are at the University of Nevada, Reno libraries. So we still consult with a lot of that. And the work that he did researching kind of the early history of the NAACP, and also a lot of the kind of policies and regulations that were governing that population in the early 20th century. But what happened so really it was like 5 years ago this project started, is that the State Historic Preservation Office got a grant to commission what's called a historic context about African-American history in the state of Nevada. And the purpose of these projects is to do a lot of research to provide a narrative with a lot of statistics, background information, information on state policies and how they fit into the federal context, population numbers, to try to help people in the state of Nevada nominate more buildings and properties and sites that are connected to African-American history to the National Register of Historic Places, or state historic registers or local historic registers. So a context would just make it easier by providing all of the background information they would need, and then they would just need to tell the history of that specific building. So I got on board with this project to help put together the advisory board and work on public outreach, because a lot of the work that I had done with the oral history program had to do with the African-American population throughout the state, really, but I knew a lot of these players. And so I was able to assemble this advisory board. So that on the right is our advisory board. So we have Clay T. White from UNLV. A lot of people know her because she heads their oral history center. And then Brenda Williams, and we have Gloria Bennett. Demetra Dalton is with Our Story. In the middle is John Edmonds. So, and so this was our group that was statewide, and they just helped us identify places and stories throughout the state, you know, that we wanted to make sure we included. And then it also included a survey of sites that we could find that were connected to that history that might be eligible for some of these registers. So this is when I first started to really do intensive work in this arena, and it was incredibly eye-opening, and it also was very illuminating in terms of some of the data that we found. So let me see, here we go. For instance, I think just compiling the numbers, and I'll just read this, I know it's kind of small, but understanding really the small size, relatively speaking, of that population through, you know, all the way through like the middle of the 20th century, especially in Northern Nevada, helps us understand really sort of why there was a great deal of discrimination that wasn't necessarily formalized by towns or cities. You read a lot about redlining, right? And the HOLC maps. They didn't have formal redlining up here in the north, or those maps, because it was a very small town. So just looking here, for instance, you can see that this is statewide. In 1900, in that top table, statewide population of African Americans was 134 total out of a statewide population of about 42,000. So that's 1900. By the time you get up to 1940, statewide, you still had 664. Total in the state, right? Out of a total population of 110,000. And then that lower table is just breaking it down by towns just for 1940 in Northern Nevada. So the total in Washoe County, 284 in 1940. And in Reno itself, 245. So, you know, when they talk about, you know, Nevada or Reno being the Mississippi of the West, we're talking about a level of discrimination that was targeted and focused on a very small group of people. And generally speaking, the discrimination toward African Americans was equally felt by Native Americans, and to a very large extent, anyone of Asian American heritage too. But, you know, it's important to recognize the numbers. And I think they surprised a lot of us, I think. Just it's different in Las Vegas. There was a great deal of migration from the South going directly to Las Vegas around World War II, basic magnesium, a lot of federal projects that happened in Las Vegas. So that population got bigger faster. But since we were kind of pulling from this to work on a lot of these Northern Nevada projects, this is one of these, you know, one of the tables and statistics that have been really helpful for us to look at. So when I started to work more with the Daltons, so Ken and Demetrius Dalton, Kenny founded Our Story Inc. I think in the 90s. And so that you may be familiar with, the nonprofit dedicated to the histories of underrepresented communities. So not just African-American, but other underrepresented communities too. And they have a website. It's terrific. They've been doing oral histories, and they've put out several little booklets about African-American history in Northern Nevada that I encourage you to get. And we just started to work together on a number of things. So they were at the time really working on Black Springs, jumping off of Helen Townsend Parker's book, A Cry for Help. And also the fact that there are a lot of living former and current community members in the Black Springs community that wanted to have a reunion. And so they never had one. A lot of people had moved out of the area. And so they wanted to bring people together and try to collect more of their history. So I kind of got on board to help them plan that. And at the same time, Nevada Humanities decided they wanted to do a documentary about that process and the community. And so that's been airing lately. And in fact, they just announced it's going to air again. There's going to be a screening at the Nevada Historical Society in April. And I can look up that date by the end if you want to. But if you don't know about Black Springs, I don't know how many of you might have been familiar, seen that documentary. They played it on PBS too. A couple things. But so, just the short version is that it was founded in 1948, 1949, at that time, about 6 miles north of downtown Reno, in unincorporated county land. And a man named J.E. Sweat had purchased what was ranch land and divided it into parcels and started to sell it to African-American residents at a time when was very difficult for them to find land to purchase in Reno and Sparks, because although they didn't have redlining or those formal HOLC maps, what they did have were restrictive racial covenants, and those were very widespread. And I'll talk a lot more about those in a minute, because another new project I'm working on is focusing on those. And it's extraordinary how many there were, which actually prevented African-Americans, actually not any non-white person, from buying or even renting property throughout most of Reno, from starting in like the late 20s through, really, they were still being put into place in the 1950s. So any of the tracts that were founded prior to the late 1920s generally did not have them. So the oldest parts of town, but any housing subdivision that was founded from the late 20s through, 1950, early 1950s probably did. So we started to really, we've been working on the history of Black Springs, and there are a lot of photographs that were up in the UNR library archives, including these. It was sort of a story of how there was electricity because there had been an earlier community up there. It's about at the Lemon Valley exit off of 395, just to the south of that is where this little community was. And so there was electricity, but at first not much else at all. It was dirt roads. There was no sewage. There wasn't even water for the first couple of years, except for if you could dig a well, which is very expensive. And so it's kind of a story about how gradually they got more resources, they got organized, they started to write grants, and especially in the late 60s, there started to be federal money due to the War on Poverty funds and Housing and Urban Development and other federal programs. But we were really trying to put together that early history, which is tough to do because it wasn't even in city limits. And so that's a harder kind of history. There aren't as many resources for that. And then the fact that this was the stories of African-Americans meant that for the most part, their news, their stories weren't covered in the mainstream media unless it was something bad. So that was a challenge too, which is why the oral history dimension has been so important for Black Springs. But specifically, Our Story hired me to write the National Register nomination for their volunteer firehouse, which is this little building, which is essentially a garage. But because it was the site where they organized their volunteer fire department for the first time in 1970, it's eligible for the National Register. And so having this as a goal which was, it was built in 1970 by the community, and then they really only used it that way for about 15 years. And then the county just started to use it for storage because they organized a Truckee Meadows Fire Protection District, which was then servicing the North Valleys more, and there were other resources. And there always had been some around, but that organized it more, and they didn't really need this one. So the story really, though, trying to set it in context, pulling from that earlier context that I worked on for the State Historic Preservation Office, but then trying to fill out and flesh out the story of Black Springs specifically was something I worked on for a couple of years. And actually, we just submitted that nomination to the State Historic Preservation Office a couple months ago. And so they're reviewing it now. But it's basically kind of a history of that community in this document, which will be a public document. So I'm excited to finally compile that together because there were bits and pieces. Helen wrote a book that was largely kind of replicating or reproducing a series of documents that her grandparents, Ollie and Helen Westbrook, had kept in their home because they were very involved in the community. They organized a lot of the civic organizations, wrote grants, did a lot. So she kind of has those documents, but it was sort of filling in everything else around it, what we really had to do for this context for the firehouse. So that was something that I will continue to work on, but hopefully the majority of that is done. They have since turned that firehouse into a museum. So our story and some of their other volunteers turned it into the Northern Nevada African American Firefighter Museum. And so you can look on their website, Our Story Inc., and get current hours and everything, because it's really, they've done just a wonderful job talking about African American firefighters throughout Northern Nevada, and, you know, putting that firehouse in context. And so in the warmer weather, it's generally open every Saturday, but you can call and you can, you know, go and get a tour anytime. So what's neat about it is that it's really right in the middle of that whole community. And it's just a small neighborhood, and it has, I don't know, maybe 100 lots to it. It's not predominantly African American anymore, but it has two churches, two Baptist churches, the firehouse, the community center, and the rest are houses. So, and a lot of them look the same as they have. So it's a really important history, and one that I'm really happy that Nevada Humanities put some resources toward to commission Sanavi to do the documentary. But this is some images of the inside of it. So William Lobster was their first fire chief, and from what we can tell,
yeah, but it's recorded, so.
from what we can tell, he was the first African-American fire chief in the state of Nevada when they first organized this firefighting organization. So you can see they put up a lot of documents and photos, you know, told the story and everything. So it's a really cool experience to go in there. These are just a couple images of them building. It's actually just one, I think, of them building that fire station. So you can kind of see how desolate,
Switch the audio to speaker.
you know, that area was. And that's actually Chief Lobster in the cowboy hat and the white hat. He always wore that white cowboy hat. And that's Ollie Westbrook in the middle, who is Helen's grandfather, who was one of the first residents of the area. And he moved there in the early 50s.
Excuse me a minute, Alicia.
Sure.
Could everybody put themselves on mute, please? I think we're getting some interference. John and Karen, I think maybe we can hear your audio. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Would you be able to mute yourselves? Thanks.
So the city of Reno had some recognition too of Reno's first Black captains, and they had been interviewed. So this is actually on the Our Story website, where they talked about their experiences and what it was like for them. I just, looking at it, I mean, one of them I remember was saying that his first day at the job, he was asked, "Now, how are you going to make your fellow firefighters feel comfortable having you here?" He was asked that as the new Black hire. And it was just like, isn't that kind of your job to make me feel comfortable? But it's really just an extraordinary interview with them. And the city of Reno did some recognition of them too after that. So just remembering, this is the city of Reno recognition they had, where they actually gave each of them a name. And this is actually here in the middle, you can see with Lobster Lane, that's Chief Lobster's daughter, Deborah. But they had an event in McKinley it was last spring, last April, to recognize them. So with the homecoming, you know, we were really trying to get more information from them that would fill out our understanding of the why, sort of why people moved there. There aren't very many of those first generation alive today. So a lot of the people who were at that homecoming grew up there as teenagers, like they were children or teenagers in the 70s, in the 60s, a little bit sometimes too. But we really just tried to compile everything we knew. And so, you know, a lot of them had moved to Reno and Sparks and lived in Reno and Sparks first, and then heard through word of mouth that there was land, very cheap land. I mean, it was $350 a lot, but you got the parcel and that was it. It had electricity, you know, available. But a lot of them moved houses up there from elsewhere in Reno and Sparks. Some built up there, and some of the homes were actually pretty expensive and nice, but a lot of them were very rudimentary. But a lot of them were moved up from surplus. So they were, for instance, when they were building Interstate 80, a lot of houses got moved or demolished, but were offered for free. And so some of those, you know, were from that or from other types of projects in Reno and Sparks that were moved up. So they kind of told us their memories. They told us what they knew about their families' experiences and gave us some leads to look for property deeds and such, which are actually digitized in the Washoe County Recorder's Office now. So we actually have some of those early property deeds. And because in addition to those restrictive covenants, also the African Americans who wanted to build a house couldn't get loans from the bank, right? Which is the familiar story, in order to finance constructing a house or purchasing a house. So J.E. Sweat, who was the white, you know, founder of Black Springs, didn't live there, but he was the real estate agent who laid it all out, would actually act as their bank. And so up at the Historical Society, they have some of these little pass books that are the payment books where he would come by every month and take a check and they would pay him off over time and eventually pay off, you know, the mortgage. But it was just done very informally. So he was really an interesting person that I really want to find out more about. Sweat himself. There's a lot of questions about like, why did he do this? And the story that was passed down was that, oh, he had met Eleanor Roosevelt and she gave him the idea. But from my research, I found that he met her, but later after he had done this. So he was a member of the Democratic Party. You know, he was a liberal progressive guy for the time. I think that he just felt, as he said in a newspaper interview, that, you know, they should have land, they should have property just like everybody else. But it was really an outlier, you know, to have a whole neighborhood like that. So for the homecoming, they planned a big reunion. This in the middle on the bottom is a guy named Andy who came as a Vista volunteer when he was 18 years old. He came up from Arizona and was funded by federal Vista. The program was new at the time. And he came up and helped them build stuff, and he helped them apply for grants, and he helped them rename the streets. Actually, Sweat had named them after his family members, and they renamed them as Coretta Way. And there's they have Westbrook Lane for the Westbrooks, but the others are all Malcolm, and they have Martin Luther King Jr. Park. You know, they did it after African American leaders who they admired. They had a gathering of elders, and they shared their stories and their memories and sang. Singing was really big in the community with those two churches. So these are all folks who, for the most part, except for just a few, are a little older, but these folks were mostly children or teenagers in the 60s and 70s. We put together a map. This is actually the Truckee Meadows Regional Planning Agency. They volunteered to help us put a big map together. So this is us kind of putting the map together, but we put it up on the wall, and then people could write in their memories, and they could write where people's houses were. And it's just a way that I've used a couple times to try to engage people in, you know, kind of looking at these maps and pointing out the places that were important to them. And we had a lot of handouts too. And then I had put together a bunch of historic photos that I had, and we gathered some from the community in advance, and then we showed them on the wall, and everybody, you know, could look and see the pictures, and that really was a big hit. So they really enjoyed looking at those, and those helped us identify things too. And then I did some oral history at the time. These are some photos that some of the people brought in. of the neighborhood at the time. And this is the daughter of AC Jones, who was the head of the first volunteer firefighting operation. He was the head of the nonprofit. It was a nonprofit. So she told me all about him. That was great. And Nevada Humanities was filming it at the time too. So that's Carrie Barber from UNR, no relation to me, but she's a documentary filmmaker. And so she had a crew that was there. And then they put together that the homecoming documentary. And it's just a half an hour long, a little less than half an hour, but it was great. We really were involved in all aspects of it, trying to tell the narrative. And she wanted to just kind of frame it as how they're still trying to find the history and put the history together, which is true. It was ongoing at the time. And in fact, it was hard for me as a historian talking in that, because I was like, we don't really know the story yet. Like we're just sort of starting on this history. Like it's too early for me to be here as the talking head and tell you definitive stuff. So I had to kind of hedge it a little bit. But we got the basic parameters of the story down, and it's just a work in progress. And that's what the story is about. It's a work in progress. And then we've done a lot of screenings, just a couple of the screenings with it's Helen in the yellow sweater, and Sanavi, who's the director and the filmmaker, and Demetrius is over here on the left, in the left one, Demetrius Dalton with Our Story. So the other thing that we've done then is I manage the website Reno Historical. It's a website and app. I don't know if you've seen it, but we founded it when I was still at UNR, or I guess a couple years after I left. We were working on it at the time. It took a couple of years with Donnie Curtis of Special Collections. So it's a website and an app, and it's a map-based, history of Reno with all historical sites. So we put a virtual tour of Black Springs on Reno Historical, and put individual entries for a lot of the different houses. This I just love because the Buffkin family, who were some of the earliest residents in the 50s, did like a rephotography thing with their grandparents outside the house with all the rose bushes, and then the grandkids did kind of a, replicating the image a couple decades later up there, to try to just, tell the stories of these families. And then I've been doing oral histories too. So this are Deborah and her mom were related to the Black Spring story, but are also telling us about Northeast Reno, which was really what sort of where the concentration of African-American residents were through kind of the middle of the 20th century. 20th century. It's crazy to say that now. The 1900s was so long ago. We had a really great time interviewing them. So with Reno Historical too, then we got some grants from the John Ben Snow Foundation and Memorial Trust to basically add more diverse content to Reno Historical. So we already had Bethel AME Church. Bethel AME Church is on Bell Street. It was founded it was built in 1910. The congregation was a couple years older than that, but that's the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And that congregation and that site was really a hub of African-American culture, politics. NAACP met there for most of the 20th century, really, and would welcome visitors who were African-American who came to town, whether it was for a divorce or if it was Langston Hughes, who was here in the 30s for a little while and stayed on the east side, but had a lot of meals and interactions with Bethel AME. It's just an incredibly important building. So Demetrius just gave me some pictures that I haven't even put on there yet of various family members of hers getting married there. There's a picture of her when she was 8, like as a little flower girl. So I've got to add those too, because we didn't have a lot of pictures of the inside. At this point today, the Bethel AME congregation actually meets at a church in Sparks, and they lease out this church to another congregation, Apostolic Assembly. And they're interested in maybe turning this church, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, into a community center or a museum or a Black cultural center or something. So they're thinking about that now. Jacobs Entertainment wants to have the city abandon the top half of Bell Street where this church is located, because they own everything above that. It says Bell Street is on the west side of downtown between Ralston and Washington, I think, just south of the railroad tracks. So this is sort of an ongoing conversation. I was in on a meeting with the Jacobs Entertainment representatives and the congregation, and Father Chuck Durante from St. Thomas Aquinas Cathedral was there too. He's just been wonderful. And we're just trying to figure out how to work it out. So they're having ongoing conversations. But we've added a couple different things too. So one of the things that was really interesting I was trying to just go back as early as I could and remember how small those numbers were of the African-American community here. However, it's really interesting to see that in the earliest years, there seems to have been less discrimination. There was certainly less restrictive regulations governing where people of African-American heritage could live, could work. That really didn't start getting in place, until the 1920s. You have the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, the racial restrictive covenants started to be put into place. The earliest ones we've seen here are, I think, 1923. But prior to that, there was a great deal more freedom of movement. There was a lot of social mobility. And there were some very successful members of the Black community who lived here in Reno. And Martha Jackson was one of them. She had spent time in Virginia City, but she moved here and she started buying property. And someone asking something?
Oh, hi, we're getting some interference.
Families,
Could you all mute yourself, please?
or times in history where they were literally beaten down so that they would.
Sorry, I'm not sure who's talking.
They were lit on fire and.
Mary, are you able to help?
Like a famous town that lives as the African American. Yeah.
Do you know who's talking?
They went, yeah. Wiped it up. It's happened all over the state.
Whoever is talking, could you please put yourself on mute?
Mhm.
Because
It looks like it's
interfering
Sandy.
with this. Sandy.
Sandy Q.
Are we good? Okay, sorry.
Okay,
I
sorry.
know someone was
Anita.
asking questions. I wanted to be able
No,
to.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So anyway, it was really interesting. So Martha Jackson, so she bought land that was, if you're familiar with downtown Reno, it's the corner of 2nd Street and Center, like the southeast corner. So it's a big building now, but it's like right across the street from Calneva. I don't know. I could probably show you later. But so she had this land and it was right in Chinatown. So, Chinatown was on the border really, because Reno's Chinatown that was established very early because, we had the Transcontinental Railroad being constructed in 1868, which is what founded Reno. And then it got finished in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah. And then you had a lot of Chinese nationals who were looking for work. And so a lot of them continued to work around mining camps or in mining or around the railroad, but a lot of them settled in Reno. So Chinatown was on the banks of the river, on the north side of the river and the east side of downtown. And they experienced a great deal of discrimination and violence even, and, burning of Chinatown several times. But she had land that was there, and the business community wanted to start expanding because Reno was doing pretty well, like around the turn of the century, around 1900, especially after Goldfield and Tonopah were discovered and became big mining boom towns in 1900 and 1902. And then you had, unlike the Comstock, where all those big Comstock barons moved to San Francisco and built mansions, because that was starting in, 1859. The Central Nevada mining boom, those millionaires came up to Reno, and that was George Wingfield and George Nixon in particular, and they founded these banking empires. But by then also, Reno had the university, Reno was the county seat. Because it had the Transcontinental Railroad, it was a very big supply center and distribution center and had a lot of industry. So business community wanted to move and start building bigger buildings. And so they offered $10,000. $10,000 in 1905 was an extraordinary amount of money to Martha Jackson just to buy her single parcel, because they wanted to build a big Oddfellows building there. And she and her neighbor Sue Wah, who was a Chinese national, were offered all this money, and she held out for more. So this is just part of the story on Reno Historical, but she said she was holding out for $13,500 because that's what she thought it was worth. And so she said, I don't need to move. I don't need the money. Like, I'll just sit here, whatever. But they ended up actually selling it to, she ended up selling it to them for $14,000. So she just kind of held out for more and she got it. And then she kind of retired. She had been a washwoman, but she had been someone who had been working, but saving money like all her life. And she had bought plots at Hillside Cemetery, early on, which is pretty expensive. Those are individually owned plots at the cemetery, up there at Hillside. So anyway, it was like a really big success story. And, she's someone that I think we need to really learn more about. And another early story that is connected to the Bethel AME Church is the Hamilton family. William Hamilton and his wife, Sarah, came from California, but they had been in the South before. And Sarah was apparently born into slavery. But they went again to Virginia City first, worked a little bit there. It was really a very diverse community in Virginia City in those early years. They came to Reno and started to buy land on the original Reno town site. So the parcel that is now the Palladio, it's where the restaurant Campo, which is now Smith and River, is located. Like that parcel, they owned that parcel. They owned one of the parcel where St. Thomas Aquinas School is, the cathedral school. And then they bought land on Bell Street in the Pounding Edition. The Pounding Edition had been founded a couple years earlier, and they bought land there on Bell and had a number of different houses. And they were actually the couple who sold the land to the Bethel AME congregation to build their church. So they just subdivided their parcel. They actually moved their own house a little further north. And then the church was built to the south, and they had a boarding house nearby. So, it all was actually a very thriving, very small African-American community in, 1905, to 1910 in that part of town. So often, this is really significant because we often think about the African-American community primarily living on the east side of Reno, which was true later on. Lake Street and further east, north of the river. And we have Second Baptist Church and a lot of churches in Pat Baker Park. And, that was, a very diverse community, but probably the highest concentration of African-Americans anywhere in the city was in that region, which is part of another project I'm working on now. But this was over on the other side. And the fact that it was, the Bethel AME Church was nearby the Baptist Church, St. Thomas Aquinas Cathedral, it was Trinity Episcopal, like it was sort of the church area, and it was another church in that area. Now, what happened to the church later on is that they wanted to expand. So they actually wanted to move and build a new church in the 1940s. And the land that they were looking at was closer to the university. This was actually 1940. And there was so much protest, racially prejudiced protest about them moving closer there that they just gave up and decided to expand their existing church on Bell Street instead. But it was up on 7th Street where they were thinking of moving at the time. So the fact that they're on the west side now, I think, is very important. So this is just some of the story about the Hamiltons. And this is something that we just, I could find through newspaper accounts, property deeds, Sanborn maps, which are those maps that show you can see these Sanborn maps. These are fire insurance maps that actually show you the footprint of the buildings that were in your city at these certain times. So this is a 1904 map that's showing these yellow buildings were made of wood, pink buildings are made of brick. This is the footprint. This is how many stories it was. This was for purposes of fire insurance, but also for firefighting to be able to know, what you needed to do to try to fight a fire in any given place. There was an irrigation ditch that ran right by it. So these are just really wonderful resources. And that's what helps us piece that story together, because it wasn't pieced together anywhere else. And the fact that more of these sources are getting digitized makes it easier and easier to do this kind of thing. This is just another one that we put together, the Needham Rooming House. This is a building that's over on Elko. No, it's on Valley. Elko or Valley? I'll see in a minute. But this was one of the lodging houses. It operated as a lodging house for Black visitors to Reno who could not stay in mainstream hotels, motels, any other types of lodging due to all the discrimination. So it's actually still existing, and it doesn't look exactly like it did before, but the fact that it's standing is really remarkable. And there was a feature in Ebony magazine in 1950 that followed a day in the life, or a couple weeks, I guess, in the life of a very young woman, African-American woman who came from California to get divorced. And it just talks about what she did. And she stayed here, and there's pictures of her inside and outside. There's pictures of her at the Bethel AME Church, at the Harlem Club, which was a very popular club on in Douglas Alley that African Americans could frequent because they weren't allowed to go in the mainstream clubs. So I could go back and try to see the history of this house, which wasn't built by African Americans or for African Americans, but during a certain period of time, you know, was catering to that population. So those are the stories that we're trying to flesh out more and tell, and try to identify if any of these buildings have enough retained integrity to be listed on historic registers. I also on Reno Historical put a lot of sites in places that are not still extant because or standing, because most of the organizations and buildings and homes related to this population are not existing anymore because they were not valued. And they were, like the site that Martha Jackson owned, you know, very attractive for expansion of the commercial core. So Dixie Club was just one of them, and we can try to reconstruct that story using advertisements, you know, the maps, you know, what we can find out from newspapers, and that's one of those. So these I just love to research, and so we just applied for another grant from John Ben Snow to add some more and tell these stories, and I hope that we'll continue to do more of those. Another project then that they all really intersect, but a couple years ago, Jonna Ireland, if anyone of you went to this exhibit at the Nevada Museum of Art, but she's a photographer, she's from Los Angeles, and she had started to photograph houses in LA that were designed by the prominent African-American architect, Paul Revere Williams, who was very active through a lot of the 20th century. He designed a lot, they called him the architect to the stars, but he designed a lot of houses for celebrities, movie stars, wealthy people in the whole Los Angeles area. But he also designed for over a dozen buildings and even some housing projects in Southern Nevada in the state. And so I was commissioned by the museum to research and write about his Northern Nevada designs, and did that for, I don't know, it took like well over a year really. And then we had a whole series of projects. And then she came up and she took photographs of all of his, you know, work in Nevada that's still standing, and most of it is. And that was then exhibited at the Nevada Museum of Art, and then also at the Nevada State Museum in Las Vegas. And then it went traveling. So it actually was most recently at the American Institute of Architects headquarters in New York. And so it's been kind of toured around. But that's Jonna taking pictures in the Lear Theater, if you've ever been into the Lear Theater. So he designed the Lear Theater, which was actually the first Church of Christ Scientist, and he designed that in 1939. So all of his work in Northern Nevada was in the 30s and 40s. And it's just been very interesting to try to explore that time period, because remember, again, our 1940 population was so small, you know, like under 300 people were here. But in the 1930s, that's when Langston Hughes came here and was over on the east side. He wrote some short stories that were based in Reno. That's when Paul Revere Williams was here doing designs, you know, from California, you know, here. And then, you know, what was happening with Bethel AME, and they weren't even, you know, welcomed to be up near the university. So all these things are like intersecting together. These are the designs, the projects that I researched that Williams designed in Northern Nevada. So the main ranch house at Rancho San Rafael, that is his design. If you've been in there for a special event, it's the one that they rent out for special events. And it's in the top left there. So it's right at the edge of the Arboretum. And that was for the Herman family. They bought the Pinkalinis Ranch and turned it into kind of their own private sort of haven. But they were very, very wealthy people from Southern California who had moved here for tax purposes for the most part. and I researched their whole history. He also did, of course, the Lear Theater there is to the right of his picture, and the El Reno Apartments, which were a whole series of, I think there were 15 of them, these little houses in the top right there. They're all dispersed around town, but they were built originally as one big complex and used as apartments on South Virginia Street, where statewide lighting is now. So some of them are in bad repair, but some are in great repair, and they're kind of all over town. But those are pre-manufactured homes with steel that he designed the template for, and then they were assembled on site. But he did a couple other things for E.L. Cord, because he had designed E.L. Cord's big, huge mansion in 1930 down in Beverly Hills. And then he designed his ranch house down there in Dyer, which is very remote in the Fish Lake Valley. A couple other things. Luella Garvey, he designed a house for her. She was a very rich woman who came up here to get a divorce, her second divorce, and then decided to stay. And her house is on California Avenue. It's just to the left of his photograph there. And then he did a motel in Lovelock, which is below his photograph, and a house connected to that. So that was a really interesting research to do. We don't know how much time he really spent here, but the fact that he was hired as an African-American to design so many things by white clients throughout the state of Nevada, it's pretty fascinating at the time. And there he is actually at the ranch house there at Rancho San Rafael. That's Mariana Herman, whose husband and her husband's brother was Raphael. Her husband was Norm, and then Mariana was a former actress. So that's her in front of the house, and that's Williams with some of the staff on the right. And this is Anna Loomis, who was on the building committee that actually hired Williams to design the first Church of Christ Scientist. Her family had this apartment called Loomis Manor that's here on California Avenue that everyone thought he designed, but it turns out through my research we found out that he didn't. But it's still a beautiful apartment building, and she is really the one who got him hired to design the church. So I'm really grateful to her family for helping us clear all that up. And then so this is a website that you can visit for all of our research. So the essays that we all were commissioned to write are on alegacyrevered.org, and that's maintained by the Nevada Museum of Art. So you can read about him, and there's essays about him and about his work in Southern Nevada. And then my research for Northern Nevada is there too. I was highlighting other work that others had done also in this talk, and this is a documentary that you can look at Vimeo, and if you just like put Vimeo in 3 weeks, you would find it. But this was a film that a graduate student at UNR was doing for one of her projects, but she's a returning student, Nancy, like we're about the same age. But she put this together about all the discrimination that was in Reno, and the fact that for 3 weeks during the course of the Squaw Valley, now Palisades, but the Squaw Valley Olympics in 1960, they basically desegregated Reno in order to comply with the expectations of visitors, international visitors at the time. But it really was a very discriminatory place at that time. But for the 3 weeks, it became kind of a different environment. And then kind of went back for at least a couple more years to the way that it had been. But it's really, really great. And Geralda Miller, I don't know if some of you might know her, but she's a historian. She was actually getting her master's degree at UNR when I was teaching there in the department. And she's interviewed in it. This actually was stemming from her master's thesis, which was about that whole event and kind of the context around it. And she provides a lot of good background. She drew a lot on Elmer Rusko's research too. So it's really well done, and it's not that long. So yeah, that's one that you can watch for free also. These are some of the images from that, because it had a lot to do with the civil rights action that was happening at the time. That's Bertha Woodard in the middle, who was interviewed by the oral history program, but they had never published her transcript. But I have it, and so I use it, and hopefully we can publish it and get it online so people can read it too, because she's really extraordinary. She lived in Sparks. So these restrictive covenants, then, you may have followed that there has been activity at the state legislature to allow people to do different things to contend with the fact that a lot of us live in neighborhoods that were governed by these restrictive covenants. So even though they became unenforceable in 1948, and people still had them, though they were on the books and they could be, still implemented, and there are, even though the language has been redacted in a lot of the documents, it's still in the document. So this was, one of the first things that they did, was to allow people to disavow the language. So you might have seen that you could submit to the county a form that disavowed the language of the covenant that might still exist on your home. Then the next stage, and what they decided to do last session, was to actually try to create new documents that didn't have that. So they're going through a process of digitizing all of the covenants, those documents, which they already have actually done a lot of it. But because it's a historical document, right? Like, we don't want to destroy those documents. So we want to actually have records of where they were, what they all said, who they applied to, who put them together. And then once they have that, so UNR actually got some funding, so did UNLV in this last legislative session, to create projects that will create databases for them and have public facing platforms where people can access them and see them. And they're going to kind of map them and compile them. It's going to be a great resource, because now we sort of have bits and pieces. I come across them all the time, but I don't have a way of assessing them holistically. So I think once they have that, then they will create new records, so you don't have to have that language as part of the covenant. They're illegal, but they're still very disturbing to read, and so it would be nice not to have them on their property. These are just, I had used this when I was teaching about the covenants before, but having read The Color of Law, you're familiar with this already, how these covenants started to be more common after the Supreme Court ruled that outright segregation ordinances by municipalities, by cities or state governments, were illegal and violated the 14th Amendment. So it was a way of getting around that for private property owners to still try to maintain, right, the value of their property, by having these private arrangements with the housing subdivisions that they bought the land, they laid it all out, and then when they sold it to people, it was with this understanding, with all this covenants of all the things that you could or could not do on that property. And so they're lumped together with all sorts of things, like you can't have chickens, or you can't build an extra building. And then, of course, that National Housing Act of 1934 encouraged all of these restrictive covenants to be written to keep the neighborhoods from being redlined. So even though they didn't have formal redlining here, that was another incentive here to retain those property values. They were allowed to do that because the Supreme Court had ruled in 1926 that these private deeds and developer maps weren't similarly affected by the 14th Amendment, because individuals were entering into them of their own volition. So when we look, this is a map that I know it's from way far away, but what we have are these tract maps then, that this is one that's really, really cool because it's color coded, and it's also really, the original was really large, so we can zoom in on them a lot. But this is all the housing tracts that existed in 1927, which is around the same time they started to be written. Those restrictive covenants started to be written. Like I said, I think the first one we found was 1923 or 1924. It was one of the Newlands. It might have been Newlands Manor. So anything that's in this map, for the most part, there could be just a couple exceptions, would not have had restrictive covenants, because those housing divisions were established prior to the restrictive covenants, and they did not seem to do them retroactively. They didn't seem to impose any of them afterwards. I don't know if there even would have been a way to do that. So if people had bought their land prior to, 1924 from one of these earlier subdivisions, it would not have had those. So that is actually why it's interesting now when we're researching early Black history, is that this is where they were living. They were living often in the older neighborhoods because that's where they could live, because that's where there were not those restrictive covenants. And that kind of shows us a little bit why we had a concentration in Northeast Reno, the original Reno town site where the Hamiltons had land, right? Martha Jackson had land. They had land like early on, because those were the older tracks. Those were some of the original tracks. And so also some of those tracks that went out toward East 4th Street are over here on like the top right of this map, the Morrill edition, the Morrill Smith edition. So if you went like out East 4th Street, and the streets would be Elko, Valley, Spokane, Morrill, all of those tended to be then later where we have seen a lot of African-American residents, because that's where they settled. And so that's where they could live. So you have probably seen these, but just to show you the language and to show that, as we know, there weren't a lot of African Americans, but if you put, the minority population together, this is who was being affected. This one is one for Country Club Acres. This was imposed in 1931. This is near Virginia Lake. And it says no person of African, Japanese, Chinese, or any Mongolian descent shall be allowed to purchase, own, or lease any of said lots or parcels of ground or any part thereof, or to live upon said property or any part thereof, except in the capacity of domestic servants of the occupants thereof. And so very common language for these. Often they're very similar in what they say. So can't even rent, right? But exceptions being made for servants, basically employees.
May I say something?
Yeah.
Hi, Lake Park is up Keystone, and actually it was built, we owned a home there that was from 1949. And in that covenant for that whole neighborhood, it even says that in the contract, it says that no domestic person may ever spend the night in one of the houses. It says that in that contract from 1949.
Wow. I haven't seen that one. I'm going to look that one up now because I haven't seen that kind of language. Thank you for letting me know. That was Lake Park, huh? Okay. Wow. I mean, because it's also like, how would you enforce that? I mean, it's just such a show of racism to just sort of say like, let it be said, right? So what would that mean? Would they evict someone if they found out? Yeah. So this is just that more recent state legislative session. So just if you wanted to look it up, it's Senate Bill 368. And so that's the one that that's the one that gave some money to UNLV and UNR for the next couple of years to, as they say, identify, locate, and map any property subject to a restriction or prohibition that is void and unenforceable, right? Because they are illegal. And then removing those restrictions from written instruments using a modification procedure that they're setting forth, which is about digitize the original, create the new document. And then document the history of structural racism in this state, the harm wrought by restrictive covenants, and the perseverance of the residents of this state affected by restrictive covenants. So you were talking about reparations a little bit, right? And then provide education or outreach concerning the restrictive covenant modifications. So the folks in the history department are the ones who are working on this at UNR. Jake Dorman has been working on this for a little while, and some other members of the history department. And then in UNLV is kind of same thing. I think it's the history department down there working on it. So they're just working closely with the county on those documents. So we should be seeing the results of some of this work they're doing within the next year for sure. I know that the UNR folks are putting a website together. There's a really good one that was done in Minnesota called Mapping Prejudice, and they were looking to them, I think, for some ideas for how they might do it. So that one I think is mappingprejudice.org, but you can see how they have put together some maps and they've aggregated the data, and they have a lot of different essays that they've put together to try to explain, what you're seeing. Another project that we've been doing on too is working on the Green Book. So this is a federal project that is documenting all the Green Books. So the Green Books it was called the Negro Traveler's Green Book, and these were put out for a couple of decades as travel guides to help African American travelers know where they could stay and eat, in some cases recreate throughout the country as they traveled. It could be very dangerous, and it also could be very difficult for them to find places to stay or to eat. So it was really like a early little, AAA guidebooks, but just for this community. And the folks who are working on this have been getting in touch with people in the States to try to find out how many of the sites still exist. We're just trying to document what's still there. Where was this place, that's listed, because they have an address, but usually not a lot of other information. So we've been working with them. Like, there weren't very many in Reno. So for a while, these were the four, and often they were just the name of a woman who would be managing a lodging house, like the Needham rooming house that Emma Allen stayed in, who was the one profiled in the Ebony magazine in 1950. So Billy Ross's house, we tried to find out where that was, and the Hawthorne Guest House, Mrs. Garner, the New China Club, we know was a very prominent club on Lake Street that was operated by a man of Chinese background, but it was very open to African Americans. It's one of the few places that was, and it was a very, upscale, really nice place on Lake Street that is no longer there. There's really nothing left on Lake Street. Lake Street was really the most diverse, inclusive, oriented toward all sorts of populations stretch of downtown. And now basically none of Old Lake Street is there. Really the oldest thing on Lake Street now is the Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Hotel, which is not the first Santa Fe Hotel. The first one burned down, and that one was built. The one that's there now is built in the 1940s with a Basque heritage, but there used to be many, many more things on Lake Street that were oriented toward African Americans. The Harlem Club was right off of Lake Street, and to Native Americans, and also Italian. There were some little Italian hotels. There were more Basque hotels. It was just really, really diverse. And we want to try to recreate that as much as we can through virtual means. This is just to kind of finish up here. One of the newest things that I'm working on, the city of Reno is going to hire someone. This is a job I'm hoping to get. We're actually sending an application next week, but they got a federal grant for underrepresented communities. It's from the National Park Service, to do some work to try to identify more sites of relevance to the African American community here. So they designated Northeast Reno as the area to focus on, because it really hasn't been given a lot of attention in terms of trying to document what structures are there that relate to the African American story in Reno. And this will involve a historic context like the statewide one we did on African Americans in the state, but in a smaller area. So a context is really the narrative. I will be, if I get this, I'm saying it like I'm manifesting, but researching and writing the narrative, and then we'll do a historic survey. And then it also involves the nomination of one property to the National Register of Historic Places. So there are a number of churches up there in particular that would be eligible due to their age and their significance and their integrity. So these are just a couple that we're eyeing. The Second Baptist Church there in 1963 on the left. And then there are some smaller ones. The Greater New Hope Missionary Baptist Church is from 1975, but we're coming up on the 50-year marker. It has to be at least 50 years old. That's how they designate a historic. Starting there. So there are exceptions, but amazingly now we're 50 years past 1975. Hard for me to believe. But then Pilgrim Rest is also from the 1960s. But in addition to these, there are smaller buildings too. And there were some of the houses that are still there, including these that are on Elko, were used as churches also. They were also homes for congregations. And so these buildings are still there today. And they're kind of surrounded by warehouses, and the university is kind of moving down, and East 4th Street is moving up. So they're definitely kind of in an area that could be threatened in terms of gentrification or even tear down. So it's kind of a race against the clock in a way to try to research and document this history and let people understand how important they are, or how they can impact, our understanding of Black history here in Reno and the Black communities. And there really is nothing like a tangible house or building or site to, make that impact and help you connect to that story. So that's why historic preservation is such an important part of all these initiatives. And especially because there's really so little to work with, you know, that we want to make sure that we can save what we can. But just one of the things that I have just started to see just from doing the background research, just to send in my application for this, is that a number of the housing subdivisions in Northeast Reno also had restrictive covenants. So these are from University Heights, Sterling Village, and Alameda Heights, which are all subdivisions in that area. And here's the language, you know, that they have from their covenant. So I think that when we look at the areas, and I've looked at some census records enough to know this, like I said before, it's really the oldest subdivisions, the oldest housing tracts that are the closest in, that will be where we're going to find the houses, the buildings and the lodging houses, you know, that most relate to this community. And after the Fair Housing Act, you know, 1968, you're going to see that those obviously are not only unenforceable as covenants, but nobody is adhering to those in their sales anymore. That's when they started to redact them. So there could obviously, and are today, people of many backgrounds living in, you know, all these communities throughout the city. But when we're trying to kind of go back to that 50-year period, we're kind of thinking about up to 1975, did we see these as sites that were relevant to the Black community? And, you know, if we look at these subdivisions in this area, we can say like, probably not, you know, they probably weren't in that period of significance. So it's going to be an interesting project, whoever gets it. You know, it'll be a really interesting one to work on, I think, because we'll just sort of see how big is that area that we're really, you know, that we're really dealing with. So that is, that's kind of the extent of what I had put together. And I know I've just been talking, but I'm really happy to have a conversation too, if anybody has questions or your thoughts about all of it.
Alicia, I was wondering, what was the attraction of Reno for somebody like Langston Hughes in the 1930s? I mean, obviously, Paul Revere Williams was working here. Maybe Langston Hughes had personal connections or something, but I wonder if there was something which would have attracted a person like him to the city or the town at that time.
Well, at the time, so when he did come here, and I can't remember what exact year it was, 1938 or 9, the Nevada Museum of Art is going to have a little feature actually about him, an exhibit. So I've been doing a little research for them too. He was actually fleeing the Bay Area. Like he had actually been sort of run out of somewhere in the Bay Area, and got on a train to just go east and ended up here. And then he had a friend that he knew from New York who was living here. And he had a diary. So we know because he wrote about this. So this was a white guy. This was a friend of his who was a musician. He was, you know, Langston Hughes was just so involved in the creative environment in New York at the time. So this was a classical musician who actually was staying with some folks on California Avenue in one of the mansions. And he knew him. And so they went up to Pyramid Lake. You know, they kind of ran around town, did some stuff. He met some people at Bethlehem. So he was really only here for a little while that first time. And then I think he decided that he wanted to write about it. So he went away and then he came back and he just stayed for a little while. It was just like a month or something. And we think we know the house that he stayed in. Like he had the address, but the house doesn't match up with his description of it. So we're just trying to clarify if this specific house on Elko is the one that he stayed in. But I think it was sort of like necessity a little bit, but he wasn't here for a very long time. He happened to know someone and then he got inspired. So he wrote a couple short stories here. One's called Slice 'Em Down. I remember what the other one is called, but they're really about kind of the rough life. It's really like a kind of a tough, violent atmosphere on the east side of Reno with a kind of a whole kind of cast of, you know, African Americans there. So I think he, you know, it was just an interesting place for him at the moment. And he had that friend who was here. And for Williams, he was commissioned. I mean, the people who hired him up here also had connections for Southern California. So it was E.L. Cord, Luella Garvey had lived in Pasadena. He did a lot of work in Pasadena. He was very well known by the 1930s in Southern California, and he was very successful. I mean, he had like 15-member staff, you know, working for him. So he was doing very well. So he had a very strong reputation that would have been the reason that they wanted to hire him, because of the cachet that he brought. I mean, he really was having a fantastic career, although also still suffering from prejudice himself in Southern California. But he had reached by the late 30s, he had reached a level of professional success that those issues weren't factors anymore for him in Southern California. But it does make it interesting. He was hired up here, but specifically by Southern Californians. The Hermans lived in Beverly Hills. The ones who had Rancho San Rafael. Luella Garvey had lived in Pasadena. E.L. Cord was in Beverly Hills, you know, so that's who he was working for, were rich people. And Luella Garvey and, you know, Anna Loomis, who got him hired to do the First Church of Christ Scientist, were, you know, affluent people themselves. So that, you know, they were, Hughes and Williams, I'm pretty sure, had no relationship to each other while they were here. I think they were having very different experiences, although Langston Hughes was quite successful, and his friends were successful also at the time, but I doubt that they had any interaction with each other while they were here.
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
I just want to say hi, I'm Chastity. Like I am super just like my mind, I'm like taking so many notes. I know this is recorded, but I'm so just thankful for the research you've done, Alicia, and yeah, just really interested in even just looking more into some of these things and using some of those links that you mentioned. And also I'm with Faith in Action Nevada, and I know I'm meeting recently with Pastor Deborah from Bethel AME, and I'll definitely want to follow up with her on some of those conversations happening with Jacobs Entertainment, and also very interested and hope that, you know, you get that funding for that study with those areas around Second Baptist and Greater New Hope. That's an area that, you know, in my kind of organizing, been really trying to look more into as well, just because we see that as being more impacted by issues still today, right? And even some of the environmental stuff we're looking into. So yeah, that's very, very interested to hear more on that if that comes through.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. And it's nice to meet you. And yeah, I mean, it would be nice to talk sometime, because I mean, we're really seeing that today, as in the past, you know, these churches, these congregations are really the center of a lot of these discussions. And Pastor Debs has just been terrific. And she just wrote, I don't know if you got this email, but she's going to be singing at St. Thomas Aquinas on Friday. And she and Father Chuck have, you know, really gotten to know each other better. And he came, you know, to that meeting with Jacobs too. And so it just felt very powerful to have these congregations really uniting and, you know, really being up against power structures always, you know, still, you know, but that source of strength. And it's also been, it was really neat. I spent all day yesterday up in Hurlong at the Sierra Army Depot to do a presentation for them for Women's History Month about a woman who had worked there in the 1940s. But at the same time, there has always been a very strong connection between Reno and Hurlong and that Army Depot, which was founded in World War II, specifically as an employment place for African Americans. And so a lot of the residents of Black Springs actually worked at Hurlong when they lived in Black Springs, and they commuted up every day. So the woman who was my contact for this talk said, well, we have some gentlemen here who are African-American who have worked here for a very long time, and they actually know some of that earlier history. So I met with them yesterday, and it was so fantastic. Like, one of them lives in Reno, like one of them lives in Cold Springs, you know, I mean, Hurlong, it's a very small area, right? Like, it's tough to live up there. But they were talking about Second Baptist Church, and Bernice Matthews, who is very involved in that church, and is, of course, very, you know, everybody knows Bernice Matthews has been a prominent legislator here, and they knew her and sort of gave me some insight into her role in that area. So I'm really hoping, I'm going to, you know, call her like tomorrow probably and try to see if, you know, she can be part of that project too, which will involve oral histories also. And I don't even know if her story has been put down, but she also lived in Hurlong, which I hadn't known. So she has a connection up there too. So it's just like this whole region has all these connections together, and they just keep coming clearer. And even as small as that community has been, there's so many intersections. So I just have been asking them, what do you want to see? Like, you know, how can we help you? How, you know, how can we put resources together and just get these things documented? And but I think that church, I think Second Baptist is going to be a real prominent center for learning more about this history.
Mhm.
That's nice.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, feel free to contact me about any of this, anyone. And I'm really happy to talk about it at any time. And trying to just figure out how to get more resources together. And my whole, you know, since I left the university and have been working in public history, the whole philosophy has just been trying to get history out to the public in any way possible. So that's why it's sort of the radio pieces for a while and the websites, and especially if it can be free. You know, I mean, I think that access is so important. So I really like doing these installations, you know, exhibits, whether it's inside or outside, but, you know, website, free apps, public documents that people can access easily. So we're hoping to really continue to beef up Reno Historical and direct people to it as a place for a lot of stories. I'm starting to work with the Reno Sparks Indian Colony again to try to get more of their stories on it too. I helped them found an oral history program a couple of years ago, and they have been doing so many interviews with their elders. They've just been doing terrific. So I'm really glad that they've been, you know, able to do a lot of that documentation too. Yeah, I guess I'll stop
That's great.
babbling.
So many resources and websites to look up. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. So just sort of thinking briefly, it was just interesting the fact that the Chinese and the African Americans were sort of not in league exactly, that's the wrong expression, but were kind of compatriots in kind of holding out against these white people all around them, that they both suffered from discrimination, so banded together to some extent.
Mhm.
Interesting history.
Yeah, and the Native Americans too, you know, I
Yes.
mean, the Reno Sparks Indian Colony was founded in 1917 out at its location out there, you know, East Second, and that was really far out of town. So, and it did not have any agricultural land, you know, so anyone who was there still had to find work somewhere else. And a lot of the you know, the tribal members would work on area ranches, or they would work as domestic help. And those were a lot of the situations that the African Americans found themselves in too, you know, and they were doing domestic work, domestic service. So I'd like to learn more about that too, you know, and kind of see the connections, because New China Club, Cosmo Club, you know, some of these other clubs that we know of that were really catering to like one group or more, you know, kind of various, but the other thing that I want to look into more, you know, is more of that Asian American also, because we know that there was a lot of discrimination against Japanese in particular during World War II, in town and throughout northern Nevada and Gerlach. You know, their radios were taken, they couldn't live near the railroad tracks. And so we have some of that documentation, but I'm trying to learn more about that too. And sometimes with these smaller communities, you know, just tracking that is a little difficult, but hopefully we'll compile it together and just to sort of figure out like, what do we, you know, is it a book? Like there isn't sort of one main book on, you know, African American history in Nevada or in northern Nevada or something, but we have a lot of these public documents, and it's the kind of thing that, you know, I'd like to kind of do, but then you're doing these projects and, you know, so books have been sort of on the back burner, although that used to be, you know, what I really thought I'd be doing. But now it's just more about these public projects that people can access for free. So, but it's been terrific, and the intersections have been great. I came back from Hurlong yesterday and was just feeling so exhausted, but excited about all the possibilities for telling that history too.
Is Nevada unusual in having this degree of this level of information on local history as a smaller state? I mean, I'm sure the bigger states have plenty of it, but is this fairly? It seems a lot of in-depth research for fairly small
I don't
communities.
know. I mean, I first started researching Reno, you know, I wrote my dissertation about Reno when I was in Texas. It turned into my book, Reno's Big Gamble. And at the time, I was surprised that there didn't seem to be any real extensive history of Reno. You know, I mean, there was a short history of Reno, and there was a much older, out of print history of Reno, but you know, there just wasn't even like a main history of Reno. And I think Nevada has kind of suffered from like a lack of kind of comprehensive histories of aspects of its past. There's a lot of Comstock, you know, right? There's a lot of certain things, but there's not a lot of others, you know, and so we're starting to get some, you know, tribal history and Latino history. That's another project we're working on with Reno Historical, is to try to get more of the, you know, Latinx history here documented, because it's a more recent history, like in the larger numbers. It's sort of like a 1970s since, but with a lot of earlier also. It's just that, again, it's one of those situations where you've got to piece a lot of stuff together. So, you know, sometimes it's hard, you know, it's hard to try to fit it all together into something comprehensive. But I think that we just lay the groundwork now, and we do a lot of this primary source research and try to get it out, and then people can synthesize it later, you know, and that's sort of been my theory. You know, we did a whole website about the Reno divorce industry because Mela, who is my like colleague, and I have both done a lot of work on the Reno divorce, but we just couldn't get a book together because we were doing so much stuff. So we're like, let's just do a website. We'll throw all the stuff up there, you know, and other people can draw on it. And they have. And now there's all these novels based on, you know, divorce ranches coming out. There's like an author is coming next week with another one. So, you know, part of that is just like get the material out, and then people can piece it together. But these historic contexts that the State Historic Preservation Office commissions are really like a little book, you know, it's just that people don't know where they are. So I think that's one thing, is to draw more attention to them and on, you know, this work in Northeast Reno, so people aren't reinventing the wheel and can find the resources that exist, because there often is research other people have done. People just don't know about it, you know. So that's another initiative.
Lots of exciting areas. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're really smart to just get the information pulled together, and I'm just going to be fascinated. I hope I live long enough to see how some of these pieces cross each other and are interwoven with each other. I'm glad to hear there's some interest now in picking up the history of the Latino community. And I was curious as you talked about the overlay of the indigenous community. So I can tell you're really excited about what you're doing, and you got me excited too.
Oh, good. That's the goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia.
Yes,
That
thank
was
you,
really
thank you. It was very
great.
interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. My pleasure. And thanks, Rosalind, for extending the invitation.
Sure. Lovely to have you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah,
Night,
you
night.
too.
Thank-
Okay. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Oh, boy. Okay.
Okay. Is there anything else we need to know? Oh, Deborah, you're mute. Deborah, you're mute.
I went to the wrong place to unmute. Is the recording going to be available?
We'll try. I don't know. See, this is the first time I've recorded something like this. And so I'm going to try to figure out if Carol will just automatically get it or what. I've never tried to record something before. The Sunday services get recorded, but I don't do it. It's
Right.
automatic that
Uh-huh.
it's set up.
Oh.
And so this first time I've tried to record something that wouldn't have otherwise been recorded. And I'm going to try to see if I know that when we all get off, there should be something saying, here's the recording, and I'm going to try to send that to Carol. But so we will try to save it. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
My sister
great.
called and I lost all track of time. So I missed a bit of it, and I'd love to hear the first part.
A lot of the first part was about Black Springs and where we visited.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah,
a lot of it
and-
had to do with that.
And the documentary, which some of you
Yes,
may
and the
have seen.
documentary that was recently,
Yeah.
I think I, I saw it on PBS, I think.
It was,
Yeah.
it was on PBS, yeah,
Yeah.
right. And what was,
I
did
wondered if
anybody
we
get-
should have told, oh, sorry.
No,
I just thought maybe we should have told her that we went there because she was kind of telling us about Black Springs as if we wouldn't have
knew
known
nothing
anything
about it.
about it.
I
and
think I did actually tell her that when I first spoke to her, but she might have forgotten. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not
Or
surprising.
it could be because she didn't know how many people had been there or not been
Oh,
there.
yeah.
She
Yeah,
That's true
True,
too.
true.
Yeah.
And I might have said not everybody would have been there. I can't remember. Yeah.
Didn't
right.
we do share the plate with them a couple years ago?
Oh,
The
Yeah, Black
Our
Springs.
stories,
Yeah.
yeah, we
Yeah.
did.
Not even a couple. I think it was, oh, maybe it
Yeah,
was. a
well,
couple. Yeah, maybe it
I
was a
mean,
couple.
COVID already was, but I remember
Yeah.
and they actually did a special, it wasn't too long because NPR,
Yeah.
KUNR had a special all about that church